All right, welcome to SIG Auth for July 26th, 2017. Let's just go ahead and jump into the agenda. So first, we can just go through some of the open polls. Not all of these need discussion. Some of these are just kind of FYI. There are a couple expansions of node permissions based on what was started in 1.7 with the node restriction admission plugin. So the first one is letting nodes evict their own pods, which is basically just a controlled deletion. So nodes can already delete their own pods. So this lets them go through the eviction sub-resource so they can respect eviction policy. Just as an FYI, I will be opening up a poll to discuss how we want to control nodes labeling themselves and removing taints from themselves. That's kind of the last piece that I have in mind for subdivision of nodes. If you let a node label and taint and untaint itself, then it can steer pods to itself that come along with highly privileged secrets. So we don't want to, we want to have a way to control that. So I will be opening that proposal this week. Eric had put together just some documentation around the discussions that we've had around access patterns for secrets and kind of future-facing expectations around watch capabilities and things like that. So if you want to look at that and comment if anything could use clarification. We want a place to point people that is kind of our best current recommendations. The self-subject rules review. This is a PR in progress to add an API that lets a user find out what the authorization policy would let them do. So there were actually some open questions that we wanted to talk about here. So David, do you want to talk about that, Eric?
Sure. So things that have come up when we were initially reviewing it, much of it is pretty straightforward, right? There is it's implemented using a separate interface so that an authorizer that supports the, I don't remember what it was called, but essentially the reverse index interface will be able to say these are the attributes for the things that you can do. And since the attributes are codified in a generic sense, RBAC happens to use the same name, but they're codified generically, it's reasonable to have it in a generic API. There were questions about how to structure it though, right? Normal users are going to make requests inside of a namespace. So it's natural to grant them that power inside of a namespace. The actual fan out from doing it across the entire cluster is so expensive that you can't reasonably do it, at least for the authorizers we know about now.
And when you say across the whole cluster, you mean find out the permissions within each namespace across all namespaces. So,
correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Which makes it seem logically namespace scoped. But the fact that it is a self-review means that someone inside of the cluster should always be able to ask about themselves. And if they want to ask about any given namespace, they should. Structuring it as a cluster scoped resource in that sense makes sense, and it makes it congruent to the self-subject access review that we have that performs a different function, but is still about a self, about the subject coming in. And actually, Jordan, I think it convinced me that for consistency, cluster scoping it made sense.
And just to be clear, it's cluster scoped, but still querying namespaces.
Right. So this is describing an API where you ask the server, what can I do in this namespace?
It gives back things like you're allowed to edit and create replication controllers, but you're only allowed to view jobs. I'm sure not as an example, but that's an example of what it does. So I think Jordan actually convinced me that cluster scoped here is a good idea, and that consistency in our API is probably going to be helpful. Otherwise, things start to look weird when users start using them.
Yeah.
If no one has other comments on that one, the extra data is a little bit more interesting and less obvious, I think.
Yeah, I'd be happy with cluster scoped just for consistency it's odd to let people post things to namespaces just for purposes of querying.
Yeah, because it ends up special case there because you can create it even if the namespace isn't there, so you can't go sniffing. Yeah, I'm convinced.
Okay.
The other one is control over extra. If you guys recall, long ago now, over a year and a half, we added this concept of an extra field inside of user info. And the extra field allows an authenticator authorizer pair to pass information through. It exchanges it passes the information from the authenticator to the authorizer in an opaque way that neither layer can guarantee will always be present unless it's configured to match. And so people we know who have either wanted to use it or have used it, OpenShift has used this to indicate scopes on a token. The token comes in with scopes. The authentication layer is able to inspect it and say, oh, you're David, but the scope of this token is you are only allowed to request subject rules reviews. You cannot do anything else. You can't create pods, but you could look to see if you could create pods, as an example. And the other one that I had heard of is, for a while, I think it was it Keystone, or there was one other authenticator that was talking about using it to pass custom role information through so they can make decisions. Their example was widening, but OpenShift's example was narrowing. I think it makes sense to include this information inside of a subject rules review, a self-subject rule review, because you can come in as yourself, but want to know, if I had this additional information on me, what would I be allowed to do then? And since it is a self-check, if you use a narrowing permission, it's fine, right? There's never an issue with specifying a narrowing permission. If you lie and specify a widening permission, it's a self-check, so you're only lying to yourself. Does that make sense?
Would it allow any kinds of sniffing though? Like, just sort of spitballing.
Yeah, that's my concern. So if it depends on what information is in the extra field. So in the OpenShift case, we only we have a similar API to this, but we only let you specify scopes. So rather than being able to override anything about the extra field, you could ask, could I do this with these scopes? Could I do this without these scopes? Once you make it generic, it depends on what the server authentication layer and authorization layer are using the extra field for.
I forget what we do this for authentication, but in authentication, there are two unique APIs. For one is querying what can I, or who am I? It's the token review, and then there's, or one of them, sorry, the access one. Like what can this person perform this action? Those are split up between can I perform this action, yeah.
So that's correct. There's a self API and a full API where you get to fully specify the subject.
Yeah.
The same could be done here, but I would not envision giving arbitrary users the ability to ask what any subject could do. That seems much more powerful. And the case where you have a scoped token that is only able to be used to check your unscoped permissions. Like using that token itself, you can't do any of those other things. You can't create pods. But using that token, you could ask if the subject associated with it could create pods. So the extra information associated with the token limits the token's power, but you want to be able to ask about the subject associated with the token. It's subtle, and I can see it both ways.
I think that works in the purely limiting world, where extra is only to scope down permissions.
Yes, but we've let the extra field into the world to be used as it is used.
Yeah, and I can tell you, we use it in some cases to grant like very short-lived administrative permissions beyond what you would normally have.
But if a user ran this check using that flag or that indicator, they would only be lying to themselves.
They would be discovering information about other things. Like I could use this to discover if other namespaces exist or something.
No, you can't.
If the extra field gives me administrative field, like.
Well, you would ask, and you became, say, you were a cluster admin.
Yeah.
You would end up lying to yourself that you had powers in the namespace. This doesn't indicate to you whether the namespace exists or not. It only indicates to you whether you have powers in that namespace as it exists or doesn't exist today, right? So a cluster admin, for instance, would always have powers inside of a namespace, even if that namespace didn't exist. But a regular user would never have powers inside of a namespace that didn't exist. So you can see that because if you lie and say, I'm a cluster admin, you don't get any.
I think that relies on the fact that
it depends on the authorization layer.
Yeah.
So if your authorization layer does leak information about existence, then, and it does so based on attributes in the extra field, then you could expose that.
Well, but to do that, you would have to have messed up when you wrote the extra interface, right? Like this interface, you don't get it for free. This isn't going to just suddenly start happening, right? Someone is going to have to go into each authorizer and say, for each authorizer, this is how I do this reverse lookup. And if they have a need to handle certain things specially, they will know that and they will choose how to handle that. Right? This doesn't force it on anyone.
So you can, it seems like you could do this with impersonation or something like that. Like you would want an access check to figure out if somebody can find information about this user or this particular extra field. Like it works really well if they're restrictive, but when they're powering, it seems like we don't want to mix that with a self-review. We would want to create a unique subjects rules review where someone can ask about anything.
Well, so I guess I'm still struggling with the how it actually expose something, right? Like so someone uses their extra field to grant the additional role piece or whatever. It would be very easy for the person who is writing their I don't remember the name of the interface, but writing that interface to be able to say, I'm going to add an additional check to see if you can actually use this bit of extra, or I'm just not going to respect this extra at all, or I'm going to return an error if you perform various things. They get a choice of how they wish to handle it.
Yeah, I think I agree. I don't think it gives you visibility into anything that you wouldn't have visibility into anyway. If you have some magic extra field that grants you something, you could discover the things that you could discover whether or not you pass it through this API.
But you don't have to have the extra field, though.
You don't have to. No, it would be optional, right? It would be the exceptional case, and as Jordan described it, you can use it as an exceptional case for like a delegated auth check. Like I have this separate things trying to make a decision based indirectly on this other privilege.
I do sort of agree with Eric, I think, that it's kind of weird that I think of the extra as being a property of the user. So if it is really a self-subject rules review, then it should be the extra that came in with that call. Is that just even weirder?
But it seems weird to let me selectively. So my assumption about extra is that a lot of authorizers are going to be using this to grant powers rather than restrict them. And it seems weird that I am allowed to not have the power, but look it up, but I wouldn't be able to change who I'm in or change what user I authenticate as.
So imagine something like, say, a concrete use case. Imagine something like, Jordan, you're typing loud.
That's not me.
Wait, that's somebody else? I'm shocked. Imagine a use case where you have granted rights within your cluster and to look at pods or whatever, jobs, look at jobs. And you have a different system that is going to allow you to get a prettier look on jobs because you want to do some post-processing or you want to relate it to some other piece or you're tying multiple namespaces together and you're giving it a view look. You want a user to let you know somehow that they are allowed to look at jobs in general, but they don't want to give you a token that gives you the power to look at the jobs. Does that make sense? So
it does. Oh, we're cut off.
Yeah. So it is a subtle thing, right? It's the I want to know whether I could do this thing if I were not being otherwise limited.
Yeah, I guess it is weird to me that we would allow this configuration for extras but not groups.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I would expect the extra to get passed along with the same subject, just like the groups would, of the caller. I don't have a concrete use case where that is better than the other case. It just seems more consistent with the other APIs.
And I think the proposal is that by default, that's how it works. By default, the full subject is the self that submits it. Would it make sense to have a paired set of APIs, self-subject rules review and subject rules review? And in subject rules review, you can fully specify the subject, just like the subject access review. And David, if you wanted to, if you had a specific extra field that you knew was a limiting field and you wanted to let the user ask about cases where that limitation was removed, you can front the API and copy everything about the subject, let them override that one field, and then under the covers submit a...
It doesn't satisfy the same use case. Right, it doesn't satisfy the use cases we have found in OpenShift for this API, as a for instance, right? Like, we have experience tying this to a Jenkins authorization layer. And the API that you described would not fulfill the needs of that use case. I mean, that's why it's not a purely theoretical concern that this is a thing.
It doesn't sound like there's consensus on it. Let's move forward with the namespace or the cluster scope bit, and we can keep discussing the extra data. I think concrete use cases and discussing how those could be solved, and maybe the concerns about it and how those could be mitigated. And we can continue talking about it in the poll.
Sorry.
Just a couple. Well, one housekeeping poll. The automatic binding of the system node role that got announced as deprecated in 1.7. There's a poll to remove that. I know deployments that were setting up non-standard kubelet usernames have already been doing this binding. So in GCE and GKE, they already set up an explicit binding for the legacy kubelet user. So that is there and is release noted. There's a pull open to promote RBAC to V1. I looked back over the notes and discussions, and I didn't remember any changes or anything we were planning to tweak promoting to V1. If I have misremembered that, please comment in the poll. Otherwise, I'd like to see that progress and start working on the documentation improvements and sort of the community add-on. Now that we have a V1 API to write to, I feel better about asking people to add RBAC manifests to various add-ons. Okay. Here's the other, miscategorized this. There's a proposal from SIG Storage related to persistent volume resizing. And as part of that, they are working through the data flow for how the user requests that. Right now, it looks like it's via the PVC spec, and then how either the provisioners or the nodes react to that by resizing the persistent volume, and how they indicate that the resize is complete. And right now, it's looking like they will write to PVC status. And so in order for that to happen, nodes need write permissions to that status field. And so I'm working with them to allow that. We already have the graph of which pods are bound to which nodes and which PVCs are being used by those pods. And so we can authorize that. I think this is encouraging. This is the sort of thing that wouldn't have been noticed necessarily in previous releases. And now we're actually thinking through, like, does it make sense to give a node write permission to any object of this kind, or only ones that are related to the node, and how should they be related? So this is, I'm glad to see this kind of discussion taking place after the node restriction stuff that went in last release. Next up was the kubeatom HA implementation. I'm not sure who put this in, if someone wants to talk about it, if there were specific issues that they wanted to raise. I take the deafening silence to mean perfect agreement. All right, if folks want to look at that and comment, it'd be fine. Moving on, there's a proposal for a vault-based KMS provider. And I think I saw that they joined. If you want to talk through that a little bit, you have the floor.
Hey, Jordan, this is KK.
Hi.
Very quickly, this is based, this closely mirrors the envelope encryption scheme that Saksham Sharma put together. He's using the Google KMS for that. This would essentially provide a mirror image of that, but use Vault as a KMS provider. The proposal simply goes along with the same models that Saksham outlined. You would have a KMS provider and a provider factory. You could configure one KMS provider in a given Kubernetes deployment. So you could configure Vault to be your KMS provider, for example, HashiCorp Vault. The benefit we see to the community is that a lot of customers already use Vault to manage secrets and encryption keys. You can use the transit backend in Vault to encrypt and decrypt data that's going to HCD without necessarily persisting it in Vault. So you're using it as encryption decryption service with the key encryption key itself being managed in Vault. That way you have separated out the responsibility of key management, the strength of the key that's used as the key encryption key, you're giving people who have security, DevSecOps responsibilities the privilege of managing those keys, while the data itself in etcd stays encrypted. This builds on the transformer work that Clayton did and on Saksham's proposal for the KMS service. I'm looking for comments if people find it interesting.
Just as a general comment, it seems like this is actually instrumenting the API server, or at least the storage layer, to be able to talk to Vault. Has there been thought about what a general API so other people could plug in KMS providers looks like, or is that just not within this conversation?
So this is actually the second implementation of an envelope encryption. So the interface was added, I think, last week, and there's a Google implementation for the Google KMS, and this is a Vault KMS. So it is implementing an envelope encryption.
And I would feel much better about having two rather than having one.
Yeah, absolutely. I am curious, performance-wise, what this actually looks like in practice, the latency of round-tripping to either Vault or Google KMS for every etcd read and write. So
it's not every read. It's only writes, because there's an LRU cache of the deck. So it's basically what'll happen is when the master comes up, it'll because everything is polling secrets fairly quickly. Very quickly, it will finish its LRU cache. And so then all the decks will be available, and then I'll just use the cache. So it has the decrypted decks held in memory, and so then after it's got those, then it's only on like new secret writes essentially that you need to talk to KMS or Vault.
Okay. I misread that though. This was talking about decrypting secrets in process, and so I assumed with this, it was no longer decrypting secrets in process.
So I believe the Vault provider or the KMS provider is being used to just decrypt and encrypt the data encryption key, which is still kept in the API server. So all that Vault or KMS, Google KMS needs to do is just decrypt the DEK or the data encryption key, and all the secrets in etcd are still encrypted using that DEK. So there's no network traffic going to the KMS provider at that point of time, except for initialization time.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, I need to read more deeply. It seems odd to me that it's very important for the encryption key to never leave Vault, but decryption keys do leave Vault.
So the scheme is one deck per secret. So the maximum blast radius of each of those decks is one item. And so yeah, I think like we talked to a bunch of crypto people internally at Google, and this was definitely their recommendation that for the envelope scheme, this is kind of the standard way to do it, is that you have a deck per item, and then yeah, your kek just never leaves your store, whatever it is, and just creates those decks for every new item. And this actually makes the rotation a lot easier too, because in just kind of like the steady state rotation, you just need to rotate the kek, and then it'll start writing, new decks. And if you have an emergency, you basically need to rewrite everything if you're very worried about keys being compromised. But in just kind of like steady state regular rotation scenarios, the rotation is very easy, and so that was part of the motivation for going this way.
And the other benefit is that the ops team that's operating a Kubernetes cluster can have the security guys go and say, yep, I need to rotate the key, and they don't need to come and bother the people who are running the Kubernetes cluster itself.
Yeah, sure. and just for a little bit, I guess, to expand on kind of how we expect the Google KMS part of this to work, essentially, there'll be UI that says, you can just click a button that says rotate the key, and then it'll just happen.
Okay. Well, thanks for the overview. And I agree with David. I like 2 implementations for an interface before I feel comfortable about the interface. So that's good to see.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, and Jordan, it's like Saxon's last day on Friday. So if you could help him out with that review, that would be amazing.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
It's Saxon's last day on Friday. And so that's the Senti-thread review there that you just commented on. Yeah, it would be great if we could kind of nail that down.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Matt, I think you're up next.
Yeah, so I don't have a full proposal yet. I just have sort of an idea, and I wanted to throw it out there and see if anyone would like to work on it with me, or if you have thoughts. So in 1.7, there was support added for dynamic registration of admission controller webhooks. So instead of as a command line flag to the API server, you can now at runtime sort of install an add-on that adds itself as an admission controller. And I would like to do a similar thing for authorization webhooks and audit webhooks, so that you can sort of deploy a new authorization webhook or a new audit webhook as an add-on onto a running cluster without. Anyway, obviously there's some auth concerns here. This is sort of equivalent to cluster admin. But I think we can work through those. Anyway, I hope to come back sort of next week with the actual proposal. But if anyone has input, hit me up in Slack or whatever.
Yeah, I guess I have some general comments on it, right? So the dynamic admission control was added after we had clear use cases around adding aggregated API servers, which could logically impact the APIs that we have, and that admission is a strictly limiting activity, right? You can never allow from admission, you can only deny from admission. I don't see the same sort of use case around authorization in particular, right? I don't see a use case of someone saying, I'm going to extend my cluster, and oh, when I do that, I'm going to change my authorization layer. And I'm also concerned about the distinction there where instead of being limiting and getting a chance to say no, an authorization layer actually gets a chance to say yes. And so both of those things concern me.
Yeah, so I definitely agree. Like installing one of these webhooks is potentially like an escalating activity. So I mean, it only makes sense. I think if this is a new resource type, it makes sense for that resource type to only be accessible to cluster admin.
Yeah, I have a comment here. It's Steve Harris. We have a situation where we administer a cluster, I'll say on the inside of it, but we don't have the capacity to reconfigure it easily. There's a lot of echo, I'm sorry. So restarting the API server with the command line options to set up the webhook authorizer, authenticator is very difficult for us. And maybe our situation is peculiar, but I understand the danger that you're describing, but it sure would be convenient for us if a cluster admin could install a new webhook authenticator in a running cluster.
If you don't have access to the master, then wouldn't that be a concern though? Like, I get the use case, it's just on the same way as I'm sure GKE doesn't want you installing new authenticators onto your API servers. If they're not giving you access to the master, then would they ever want you to would an administrator ever want you to be able to do this?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a case where you might have a cluster where you don't want to support this API group. I think that's how the admission controllers are set up too. It's a sort of opt-in resource.
I guess what I'm saying is that I don't see a clear use case for this in the same way. And it seems like if you want to get to the point of having dynamic config, we would let other components move forward first, ones that have started down the path, work out kinks, right? Kubelet tried last release and didn't make it. And so I'd like to see that work first, and then perhaps look more holistically at a dynamic config overall, rather than trying to special case something for authorization and even audit without having the same kind of clear use cases that we had for admission.
One thing that I would note is that you could actually do this today by implementing a dynamically registrable authentication server, and then point to that as your webhook server. So you could implement this separately, be able to register and unregister things to it, and make that your webhook handler, and then it could fan out to whatever. Or if
right,
I agree.
I agree with that.
This could be done out of core. I would like to see it sort of demonstrated and demonstrated why it's necessary before really pushing on it in core.
Yeah, I definitely agree too. I think this is definitely hinting at some broader dynamic configuration structure for other components too. So it's hard in terms of like doing sort of like a federated, like a proxy that stands out. I think that's true, but it still assumes that you are running that. You still have to restart the cluster once. You still have to restart the API server once to set that thing up. So I think the core need of sort of deploying an add-on to, let's say, add an audit stream into a running cluster without having to restart and reconfigure the cluster. I think it's still true, even though you can sort of fan out on your own. Anyway, okay. I will ship this around a little bit to some other SIGs, and I think see if there's broader support for dynamic config as a larger project, and then maybe auth can be a later part of that.
Yeah, and I think dynamic config is something, like David said, we want. I think we're starting with things like scheduler and kubelet, but certainly dynamic config of API servers, if we can figure out how to manage it, is something that could be useful for a lot of reasons, right? Like there are a lot of flags to the API server, and the auth and authorization flags are a subset of them, but there's lots of things that people want to change, and being able to manage restarting that. Stephen, to your point, figuring out how to do that in environments where you don't have access to restart servers or is useful even beyond this SIG. So
yeah, I guess more broadly I would say it's like for hosted situations, but there's still this problem of who's really the administrator anyway in these cases.
Right.
I understand.
I mean, in a hosted scenario, if they give you control over the options, and then there's a Kubernetes project endorsed way to roll that config out dynamically to your HA API servers, I mean, they can decide, should you have control over the config? And if you should, then that gives them a controlled way to roll it out. And if you shouldn't, then they're probably also not going to be happy with you monkeying with the authentication configuration. So
yes, I locked myself out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. Thanks for listening.
All right. Well, that was all we had on the agenda.
Hey, Jordan, I have a quick question about the subject rules review again. Yeah. I mentioned it in the doc. I was just wondering if anybody else had thought through the webhook piece of that. Do we just expect that webhooks will implement the internal interface and then call out using the new API object?
Yeah, this is an issue for all authorizers, right? It's a new function that an authorizer can support or not. We have ABAC, RBAC, webhook. Is that it?
Allow all. I can tell you what that one will say.
Yes, that one's really easy. And so that would be my expectation. If we wanted to add support for webhook authorizers, it would be a second API call, API request response. They wouldn't have to support it. If they did, the results could be stitched together. If you have authorizers in your chain that don't support it, I think we need a way to indicate that the results are potentially incomplete, right?
Yeah, that'd be really nice for GKE, because I can see us getting into a weird situation where we give people an inconsistent view of the world.
So we already do, the PR as it stands already does return an error if any of your webhooks don't or any of your authorizers don't support this, or any of your authorizers hit errors during the middle of evaluation and calls out that these results may be incomplete. It seems weird to try to figure out if an existing webhook supports it or not, supports the new functionality. But maybe we can do something like add a second webhook flag. I don't know if that sounds palatable to anyone, but Joe Beta has asked in the PR that we maybe open a feature repo item, because it seems to be a pretty largely scoped thing and adding a new API. So I will open that and be sure to comment at least about the webhook auth.
One other discussion, the webhook thing reminded me, the APIs that we use to call webhooks are sort of frozen at v1 beta 1, the way we send and receive information from webhooks, the token review and the subject access review. Those APIs have been promoted to v1, and I would like a year from now to be speaking the v1 APIs to webhooks, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to make that possible in 1.8, but keep the default at v1 beta 1, and then give 2 or 3 releases notice to say the default is going to change to v1, to give people a way to opt in to v1 now, and then have to deal with the switch. Right now, you configure webhooks by giving it a kubeconfig, and I need to look and see if there's a field in there that we could let you opt into v1. I think there might be.
Kubeconfigs definitely have like a preferred version. I just think that I remember it being marked as deprecated, but we could.
The webhooks are kind of abusing the kubeconfig fields today anyway, so I'm not sure. I'll probably open either a PR or a proposal, maybe just a PR, and we can talk about it there. But I didn't know if anyone else had thoughts about that rollout. I know GKE is using the webhook. Some other folks are. Doing it over 2 or 3 releases, does that seem reasonable to people? Kind of opt in now and then deal with it in, probably 2 releases, maybe 3. All right, I'll open an issue and we can talk there. All right, does anyone have anything else before we sign off? All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.